This quilt was made by my daughter, who I've mentioned in other videos. She took a quilting course, and one of the ladies running the course asked her, "Honey, did your mom or grandma teach you how to sew?" And my daughter said, "No, my father did." I can't take credit for her quilting talents, but I did show her how to use a sewing machine, the same one I used to make this tarp tent I've shown in other videos. I've said I would do a video on how I made this thing, so here we go. Before we talk about how, we should talk about why. We all know most people feel no need to make their own tarp tent, and I'm sure they are 100% correct about that. So why did I think I needed to do it? If making a homemade tent seems like an extreme thing to do, it's because I spent many nights in circumstances at least a little more extreme than average. In other videos, I have mentioned my hunting experiences around the United States and in Canada. I would backpack into wilderness areas and sleep in the woods, sometimes for a week. And whether hunting or not, I loved going to places like that. Even so, on those trips, I had a lot to do. I would leave my tent before sunrise and return after dark. It might be snowing or raining or freezing cold, and I might return covered with snow or with muddy boots or with a wet poncho. When I used a commercial tent, like this one, I had to leave my boots and the wet poncho outside. If I cooked a meal, I had to do it outside, maybe in the snow or rain. Sometimes I carried a tarp to cook under, but the tarp was one more thing I had to carry. I was constantly worried about damaging the tent floor or getting it wet or getting it filthy. This tent weighs 6 pounds. I also used a commercial backpacking tent that weighed 3 pounds, but it was small and cramped. Making my own tarp tents solved every single one of those problems. They have no floor, so I can crawl in if I get muddy. I can open the door, which is plenty big, and cook on a stove inside. I can burn a candle inside with no fear of burning the tent. I can pitch them very quickly. They could hold 2 people, so they're big enough for me and all my stuff. They weigh 20 ounces on average without the stakes. My pack suddenly got lighter. I got the idea 16 years ago after I bought a sill shelter, which I also have mentioned before. It's very good for normal backpacking, but I wanted something bigger for those hunting trips. So I bought a sewing machine and made the pyramid tents I show here. So what about these things on a place like the Appalachian Trail? As I've said before, wise gear selection is based on what we want, what we can put up with, and maybe what we worry about. I can tell you what I don't worry about. I don't worry about spiders or venomous snakes or getting flooded. I love spiders and say hello to everyone I meet. I've seen only one wild venomous snake in my entire life, and I'm convinced they want nothing to do with me. Experience suggests I know how to avoid getting flooded. See the description if you want to know more about that. My original plan was to install a vent at the tent's peak, but I put that off and very quickly decided I didn't need one. Many times I have left the tent door at least partly open to prevent condensation, and if I forget and do get condensation, I don't care. I wipe it up with a bandana and move on. And if I was really worried about mosquitoes, I could buy a net to set up inside the tent. So the first thing I needed was a sewing machine. It doesn't take a fancy machine. This is a Brother machine I bought for about $100. It's strong but simple and sews only a straight stitch. A straight stitch was all I needed. I can't tell you how to use a sewing machine because they all have different instructions. A sewing novice is going to have to read the manual that comes with their machine. But I can tell you the greatest challenge a novice will probably face is setting the thread tension correctly. I have used only one kind of thread, 100% nylon upholstery thread. I used it because it's very strong and it's hard to break. Once I set the tension correctly for that thread, I didn't have to make any further adjustments. That would not be the case if I used a lot of different kinds of threads. Then I would have to reset the tension for many different types. Using only one type of thread got me around that. I can also tell you I have double stitched everything I have made. That means I would sew a seam and stitch a second one right over top of it. My last recommendation is to be sure you have a stitch puller, one of these things. If we screw up, we can use this to pull the seam without hurting the fabric. And speaking of fabric, I used 2 different kinds of nylon fabric. The tarp tent I took on the AT is made of silicone impregnated nylon. It is almost completely waterproof. I've also made 3 tarp tents using regular nylon. They will endure a moderate rain and are good for winter because they can breathe better than sil nylon and still keep the snow out. In 2015 dollars, I spent about $85 on the sil nylon I used for this tent. Later, I'll tell you where I got the fabric. For the design, I didn't consider anything except a floorless pyramid tent. Pyramid tents have been around a long time and have a good reputation for standing up well in the wind. Before freestanding tents became common, mountain climbers sometimes used pyramid tents in the Himalayas and the Karakoram. They work well without guidelines, which I considered a plus. My sil nylon tent covers an area 8 feet long and 7 feet wide. But that is not the most simple design. The most simple design would have a square footprint. For example, 7 by 7 feet or 8 by 8 feet. Because if we do that, each tent wall can be exactly the same size, and that would make it very easy to figure out the dimensions. A tent covering 8 by 7 feet is not that easy. Here's my idea for designing a tent that covers an 8 by 8 foot area. Go outside and hammer 4 stakes in the ground. Position them so each stake is 8 feet away from the closest 2 stakes. Make sure they form a square. Use cordage or measuring tape or whatever you have to make sure you have the right distances between the pegs and a square shape. Then stab a long pole into the ground in the exact center of that square. If you will use an extended trekking pole for the center pole, figure out how many inches it will be when extended. Then tie a long cord to your tall pole at the same height as your trekking pole. Extend that cord to each stake, and you have the distance of the 4 corner seams of your tent. Extend that cord to the spot exactly between 2 corner stakes, and you will know how tall each wall panel has to be. If you try this, get someone to help you to make sure the measurements are accurate. On my 8 by 7 foot tent, the front and back walls are one size, and the 2 side walls are a different size. The front and back panels each have a base 8 feet long. From the middle of that base to the peak of the tent measures 67 inches. The side panels each have a base 7 feet long. From the middle of that base to the peak of the tent measures 72 inches. Each corner seam is 83 inches long. Here's one detail. I'm not really sure that tent is 100% symmetrical. It looks symmetrical when it's pitched, but who really knows? The larger point is they don't have to actually be 100% symmetrical to look and work just fine. Now here's another detail that is even more important. When we sew one of these together, I would suggest we always start the seam at the peak of the tent and work our way toward the bottom of the walls. If we do this, any mistakes we made in measurements can be corrected when the walls are assembled. If one corner of one wall is too low, for example, we can square it up after the walls are assembled. We might end up with one wall 1 or 2 inches short when the thing is done, but once the thing is pitched, it would be practically impossible to notice the difference. If anybody's good at geometry, they can calculate any size and height they want. I would suggest they start with scale drawings with 1 inch representing 1 foot of the finished tent. When I cut the fabric for mine, I made sure I had at least an extra inch on every side for the seams. Here's another detail. If the bottom of the walls are cut to be straight lines, the center of the walls will bow up from the ground when the tent is pitched, like this. Here's how I avoided that. Starting about 1 foot from each bottom corner of each wall, I made an angled cut that made each bottom corner about 1 inch higher than the middle of the bottom edge. That minimized bowing in the center. Here's another thing I did to help prevent drooping of the pitched tent. The corner seams where the walls met were not sewed in perfectly straight lines. Instead, I brought each seam in about 1 inch, and that created a slightly bowed effect in each corner seam that prevented sagging and helped keep the thing tight. This photograph is about the best image I have that shows the effect of this. If we look at the right-hand side of the tent, we see it coming in a little bit. That helps contribute to a taut pitch and helps prevent sagging. Another detail is these things were sewed together inside out. That means the extra inch I added in the middle of each corner seam went actually toward the edge of the fabric. And when the tent was turned right side out to be pitched, that meant it was bowing in slightly. Another detail is the fabric I used was not wide enough to make a complete wall panel. I had to sew a section on the top of each panel. I did that before I cut each wall to its final shape. I started with the added section being somewhat extra big so I'd have plenty of material for the final trimming. The material I got came in a long sheet, and this drawing gives you an idea how I cut out the basic 4 wall panels without the tops to conserve material. On the top of each panel I left a narrow straight section like that shown here, or a nearly narrow straight section like that shown here. The idea was to create a pocket that would hold the top of the trekking pole without sliding around. I'll show a detail of this later. For each door I bought a sleeping bag zipper at a fabric store. The doors open from bottom to top. I sewed the zipper onto the front wall before I sewed the tent together, but I didn't cut the opening under the zipper until the tent was sewn together. I'll show a detail of this later. I used 2 kinds of stake loops. On the corners I used nylon cord resembling paracord. On the bottom of the back and side walls I added long narrow flaps to give the bottom more closure. The idea was to create extra wind protection. Each one of these flaps has a grommet on each end for a stake. I bought grommet kits at outdoor or discount stores to create those grommets. Here is the inside of the peak of one tent. It's reinforced with pieces of plastic tarp. This prevents the trekking pole from fraying the fabric. Each one of these peak sections has 4 sides because the tent has 4 walls, so the peak also has 4 corners. I sewed each corner shut with a seam like this from side to side to close the top. That gives the peak a nice X-shaped seam when we turn it right side out. Here's the inside of the top of the zipper for the door. The doors on my tents are about 47 inches long. Because it's a sleeping bag zipper, it's designed to completely separate. You can see here where I sewed it shut at the end to keep that from happening. This is the original end of the zipper as it was sold, and it is at the top end of the door opening. Because the zipper was much longer than the door opening, I shortened the end that's positioned at the bottom of the door. You can see the 2 metal stops that keep the slider from leaving the end of the zipper. I carefully removed those from the original end of the zipper and repositioned them here to fit. After the zipper was shortened and sewed into place, and after the walls were assembled, that's when I cut the fabric under the zipper. To prevent fraying on a cut edge like this, I tried to carefully melt the very edge of the fabric with a candle, with the emphasis on very carefully. After the zipper installation was complete, I put together a long flap to sew down the side to keep rain from coming in through the zipper. Here is a seam at the bottom of a wall. I just folded it over and double stitched it. Here is a peg loop at a corner. I used plastic tarp here to reinforce the stitch holding the cord. I sewed these loops onto the walls so I could use guy lines if needed in high wind. Plastic tarp also reinforces those seams. As it turned out, I used guy lines only once or twice and decided they really weren't needed. This is a seam holding 2 walls together. I also used a candle on those exposed fabric edges. And of course, when each tent was finished, I applied seam sealer. I prefer the silicone type that comes in a tube. I also used my sewing machine to make silk nylon stuff sacks, so each tent gets its own sack. I would suggest anyone who wants to make their own gear visit the thruhiker.com website. The link is in the description. This site sells silk nylon. The site also has instructions for making tarp tents, but not the design I use. It also has kits for making items of outdoor clothing, like jackets, vests, and pants. It also has materials for making down backpacking quilts. Plus, the website has good articles and an online forum. This tent, again, is made with ordinary ripstop nylon. I bought that at a fabric store. I searched online and found a place that sold Primaloft or Primaloft, the synthetic insulation that came in sheets. I bought some rayon at a fabric store and made this backpacking quilt, which I've shown before. It's good for 40 degrees and weighs 24 ounces. I've camped with it repeatedly and it works very well. And now, finally, we are done. Thanks to all who have subscribed. Please subscribe if you haven't. It would be much appreciated. And thanks a million for watching.